Hi, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. I hope the weather is glorious where you are, and thank you for coming out of the sun and coming into the office, or perhaps you're streaming from your garden. If you are, I hope that's nice for you. My name is Jerard Ross. I'm one of the medical legal advisors for the MDU, and it's a great honour to introduce my co-presenters tonight. I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Sokol and Dr. Sarah Jarvis. Many of you will know Daniel from the BMJ, where he's a columnist on medical ethics, a subject in which he also has a PhD. On top of this, he's a barrister with a particular interest in personal injury and clinical negligence, as well as educational law. And as if that wasn't enough, he speaks fluent French, and most impressively of all, he's a close-up magician, and I believe a member of the Magic Circle. Is that still current, Daniel?
I haven't paid my membership fee, but I have passed the exam.
Dr. Sarah Jarvis is one of our senior medical legal advisors, and she joined the NDU with me over 10 years ago now. Before that, she was a partner in general practice in Wales and worked with the GMC. And although I don't think she's been admitted to the Magic Circle yet, she does sometimes work some magic with our members. So welcome, Sarah. As I said, my name is Jerard Ross, and I was a consultant surgeon for my sins before joining the MDU. And firstly, I want to start with a little mea culpa, because you will see that the title of the talk tonight is slightly different to that which is advertised. We're going to be discussing reflection in the context of the GMC, so it's not specifically a whole talk on the GMC investigations, which I think probably wouldn't be all that useful for many of you. But this is really talking about reflection, and Daniel's going to talk about good reflection, and we're going to put it into the context of the GMC. Please remember to put questions in the question box of GoToWebinar. You'll be sent a certificate of attendance after you've given us some feedback, and should anybody want to see it again, you will be able to look at the webinar on the website. So in terms of what we're planning to achieve, we're going to be discussing the basics of GMC investigations. I'll run over that quickly. We're going to understand, or try to understand, the value of reflection and why we think it's an important thing, and understand what quality reflection is. So why are we talking about reflection in the same breadth, the same conversation as the GMC? Well, I believe, and many of my colleagues would, I think, agree with me, that high quality reflection is one way to demonstrate to anybody who has concerns, and specifically to the GMC, that you're a doctor who's fit to practice. I remember being very concerned when, in the wake of the Dr. Bawa-Garba case, a senior surgeon told me that they discouraged their juniors from reflecting and would not do it themselves. I hope this presentation this evening will explain why reflection is important and give you some pointers to approach it in whatever context you have to do it in. Hopefully it won't be the GMC. There are other contexts clearly where it's important, because in every life, let alone just the professional one, things can go wrong. If any of you have been to these presentations before, you'll have seen this slide, or one that's very like it. Just like the poor captain on the Titanic, things can go wrong for doctors as well. And when they do go wrong, a number of things can happen at the same time. However, when things go wrong for doctors, it's quite conceivable that the GMC could become involved. It's not at all unusual in our experience for a complaint within the NHS to develop into a GMC investigation, or at least contact with the GMC. It sometimes happens in coroner's inquests and FAIs in Scotland as well. And it's relatively common in disciplinary investigations to have some form of involvement with the GMC. On top of that, it's a virtual certainty that the GMC will become involved with doctors when there are significant criminal allegations. So, what about reflection? Well, reflection plays a role in some of these processes. Reflection is important when there's a complaint, because you've got no idea which complaints are going to go elsewhere. It can be important in the coroner's inquests, particularly as an organisation, as a group, considering how a patient was treated offering alternative ways to look at what might have been done with that patient to reassure the coroner that this is not something that will go forward itself. Be repeated, should I say, sorry. And similarly, of course, it's very important within GMC investigations. As you all know, the GMC has lots of roles, and that includes setting standards, overseeing education, training, managing the medical register, and overseeing revalidation. However, the GMC also sees itself as a patient safety body in that they manage concerns about doctors. And every year, around 2 to 3% of doctors are referred to the GMC. So in a group of 1,000 doctors, which is what the number we have registered for tonight, you might get 20 or 30 doctors in that year being referred to the GMC. And I know this number sounds alarming, but actually in reality, it's a much smaller percentage of those cases that are actually investigated. So you can be referred, but not investigated. Sometimes doctors aren't even told that they have been referred or when a concern was raised. That being said, when a doctor does find out they've been referred, when they get that letter in or that email in from the GMC, it's one of the most stressful times of a doctor's career. If we look at the complaints to the GMC since 2013, which is the graph that I'm showing there now, and then we look at all the complaints that ended up in sanctions, you can see that actually the number of complaints that end in a doctor being erased, suspended, warned, having conditions, or having undertakings, it's only a very small proportion of cases that get to the stage of having sanctions applied. But for all the doctors who are aware of the referral and all the doctors from these big groups who actually have investigations, it's hugely stressful. What we're doing tonight in talking about reflection is to try and help you to avoid being referred, if that's at all possible, by managing concerns well locally. And then if you are referred, it's trying to prevent you moving into that right-hand group of doctors there that we can see at the top of the bar graph. So, although only a reassuringly small proportion of doctors receiving complaints find themselves in a tribunal hearing, as these slightly worrying statistics show, if you do end up at a hearing, there's a very high chance that some sort of sanction is being applied or will be applied, and suspension or erasure are the most common sanctions that will be applied in fitness to practice hearings. So even if you are being defended appropriately, even if we have our barristers instructed, ideally we want to avoid getting into an MPTS hearing at the GMC or involving the GMC. So who are complaints about? Well, briefly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, men get more complaints than women. If we look at this graph here, this is from May this year, when I accessed the data last, you can see that men are the light blue bars there and women are the dark blue bars there. So men are getting far more investigations, on average between 2 to 3 times more likely. And doctors over 40 tend to feature more complaints than doctors under 40. This may have something to do with doctors under 40, perhaps more from working under supervision, but it is something that we see. Doctors with no declared speciality, and rather offensively, I guess, that's how the GMC regard doctors who are not specialists in a hospital speciality, so GPs, for instance. They make up the biggest group of doctors being referred to the GMC, but then again, that's not a surprise, because as you know, they also do the vast majority of the consulting in the NHS. The next highest groups after that are surgeons, physicians, and psychiatrists. Public health physicians and radiologists seem to have many fewer cases. What are the complaints about? This is more difficult as we only have historical data to go on. The GMC doesn't give us statistics nowadays on the detail of the complaints. The GMC may investigate anything that, if proved, might indicate an impairment of a doctor's fitness to practice. And most complaints tend to come from the public, and they tend to be about clinical competence or professional performance, often combined with allegations around communication or respect. Complaints raised by employer are usually about professional performance or a doctor's health, and they tend to be taken very seriously by the GMC. Not surprisingly, complaints from the police are mostly about criminal matters. Demonstrating insight and remediation when something goes wrong is an important part of good practice, even if there's no suggestion of a complaint to the GMC. If we think back to that multiple jeopardy slide, a number of processes can occur when there's a clinical incident, and it's impossible to say in advance which complaints will end up with the GMC. Whilst there are some complaints that might go to GMC that are highly likely to go on, for instance, a patient alleging a sexual assault by a doctor. When the GMC look at an individual complaint about a doctor or concern about a doctor or series of concerns about a doctor, they look at the surrounding practice. They ask their responsible officer, do you have any concerns about this doctor? And whenever somebody's practice is put under the microscope, concerns can come out for all of us. Even the most stellar specialist can have problems in their practice or concerns having been raised by the practice at some point. As I've said, failing to demonstrate insight into a problem in your practice is one aspect of impaired fitness to practice. We're all human, things go wrong, but it's best to be open and proactive in learning of things from things that have gone wrong. If a complaint or concern is made to the GMC, being able to show that you have adopted that sort of open, learning, reflective approach is very helpful for your case. And it's particularly helpful if a concern gets to an FTP tribunal. Any FTP tribunal should look at whether what the doctor has done, since the time of the concern, whether the doctor is fit to practice at the time of the hearing. So it's not what happened at the time, whether you're fit to practice then, it's now, it's what you've done in the intervening period from the incident to the hearing that makes the difference. So remediation evidence, so the doctor having done something to address concerns about their practice as early as possible after the events is really, really helpful. So if you're ever involved in a case when something's gone wrong and think you might have done things differently, it's really helpful to actively engage with that reflection, because we know that it improves outcome. To look at the impact of insight, the GMC studied all of the cases heard by panels in 2013 in relation to conduct and performance. I'm afraid they haven't repeated the study since, but what they found is interesting and I think has some value for us. Before starting, they excluded cases about convictions and to do with allegations around a doctor's health. But they then analysed the panel judgments on the remaining 147 cases that closed in 2013. The GMC found that when insight was shown, only 5% of those doctors were erased. When there was no insight shown, 59% of the doctors were erased. Now remember, in that table I showed you, the chances of being erased or suspended were quite substantial. So roughly 40% of doctors who go to MPTS are going to be erased, roughly. But the numbers reduced when they're able to evidence their insight. So what do we mean by that? Well, insight, apologies, and remediation are things that the GMC are looking for, or the MPTS should say, are looking for in hearings and in their own guidance for MPTS panelists. They are quite clear that expressing insight involves demonstrating reflection and remediation. Now that's my emphasis on the screen there, that underlining, but I think it's just to highlight that being able to demonstrate that you have reflected effectively on something that's happened is more likely to demonstrate to the MPTS panelists that you have insight into the problem. It reduces the risks to you as an individual doctor at a hearing. A doctor is likely to have insight if they accept they should have behaved differently, so that's showing empathy, showing understanding. They've taken timely steps to remediate and apologise at an early stage in the hearing, or before the hearing, should I say, and demonstrate timely development of insight during the investigation and hearing. And part of that insight is reflecting.
Gerard, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wondered if you can share any of your experience about when that process of reflection should start.
Yeah, I think that I can probably answer it contrary-wise and say it's best if it doesn't start the night before an MPTS hearing, to be slightly flippant. But we do see that. We do see doctors coming to an understanding and insight very late in the day. The sooner that you're able to start engaging with this process, no matter how painful and difficult it can be, and Daniel's going to talk about these sorts of the difficulties that we see in reflecting, the sooner you can come to doing it, the sooner you can start the process, the better. Does that answer the question? Sarah, was there anything else that came out?
No, thank you very much.
So since we can't know which issues are going to end up with the GMC looking at them, it's worth getting in the habit, at least in my opinion, of being reflective whenever something comes up, whenever something goes wrong, and particularly whenever something goes seriously wrong. So briefly, how should we be reflecting? Now, Daniel's going to talk a lot more about this, but there is some guidance out there that you might want to look at if you haven't read it already. Within this guidance, there are quite a few useful things to think about. I know that Daniel's going to talk about some aspects of this, but one of the things to mention is that anonymized information is going to be sufficient. You don't have to, in fact, you shouldn't be naming all the parties in your reflection. You should be reflecting briefly on what happened, but mostly on what you might do differently, what you've learned, and how you would approach that going forward. It's really helpful to avoid that very emotional reflections written in the heat of the moment when something's just gone horribly wrong. That tendency to write a long and flowery or overcritical reflection is probably not helpful. And therefore, in these difficult or contentious cases, I think it's really helpful to involve another trusted colleague, trusted senior colleague, if you have any, to talk through the case. In terms of useful quotes from the guidance, it talks about focusing on learning. It highlights that these reflections are not subject to legal privilege, unlike the conversations that you would have with your solicitor or with your barrister. The conversations or the reflections that you write in your reflective documents are not subject to legal privilege, so they are disclosable if it's required. But in general, the GMC don't ask doctors to provide their reflective notes. And in fact, I hope Sarah will back me up here, it's quite the opposite. We often advise doctors to share evidence of their reflection early on. So it's exactly what the GMC may not ask for it, but we would almost always recommend that they share high quality, detailed reflections if it's going to help their case, and it usually does. Sarah, is that a fair thing to say?
I think that's absolutely the case, and often when we take advice line calls, which are generally the first point of contact for somebody who's dealing with a serious incident or a complaint, we will encourage that person to start the process of reflection and learning from that very stage. And I think it is important, one of my colleagues says that insight is the currency. That's the thing that you want in the bank, to be able to show reflection and learning and so on. I think that's quite important.
It's not just showing them, is it, as well? It's persuading them that you've done something different. I think Daniel's going to talk about how these are persuasive documents, not to try and steal Daniel's thunder.
Indeed.
The GMC also say that evidence of insight and remediation may reduce the need for the GMC to take action. So this moves that point where it's of value. So we know it's of value in the fitness to practice hearings. This moves the dial on where it is helpful. They're saying if they see evidence of insight and remediation early, it reduces the need for them, it may reduce the need for them to take action. So that's why, or one of the reasons why, I'm particularly keen to get my doctors involved in early and high quality reflection. Now, at that point, what I'd like to do is to hand over to Daniel for him to share his slides and his views on quality reflection. And I'm going to turn my camera off, you'll all be glad to know.
All right, the moment of truth. Let's see. Show screen. Does that show up?
It does. Thank you, Daniel.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much to the MDU for inviting me, and thank you all of you for giving up part of your Tuesday evening on this fine day. So, as a chess player, I like this quote by the 19th century Polish chess master Sokol, and he said, "Chess is the struggle against the error." Whenever you do something difficult, whether it's chess or law or medicine, you're going to make mistakes at some point. It's inevitable. And as professionals, we owe it to patients, clients, if we're lawyers, to learn from these mistakes and to improve. And to do this, we have to think actively about our mistakes, about how they occurred, why they occurred, and what we can learn from them so that we can reduce the chances of them happening again. So that's why reflection's important. If we do it properly, there is a lot to gain from them. And it's helpful, I think, to reframe these reflections away from being a tedious chore, and I think, let's be honest, I think most doctors think they are, to being useful opportunities to pause and learn. And the mistakes don't need to be massive blunders that lose you the game or the case or the patient. You know, the mistakes that lead you to call the MDU, there could be small mistakes. Maybe your notes were imperfect. Maybe your communication skills let you down when you spoke to that patient or relative. Maybe you weren't happy with the way you sutured the wound. And often, these things may not lead to a complaint by the patient, but you know that there is still room for improvement. So if you have any patients, you shouldn't have any great difficulty finding something to write about in your reflection. So this is a computer game analysis of a recent chess game of mine. I won the game, I was playing black, and I thought I played really, really well. And I certainly, you can see there, didn't blunder. But if you look at the analysis, you can see that I still made 3 mistakes and 7 inaccuracies. And so the lesson here is that you can find things to improve even when things go well. The bad news is that in medicine and in law, you don't have the chess.com computer analysis, the click of a button. You have to do the analysis yourself. You have to search for the mistakes and the inaccuracies. So that's my little introduction about reflections generally, but I do want to focus now more on the kind of more meaty reflections, those that you might write in GMC proceedings, or if you're undergoing trust disciplinary proceedings, rather than the kind of more regular reflections that you might write for training purposes or for your learning portfolio. Now, the easiest and I think the most engaging way to talk about a good reflection is to look at what makes a bad one. In fairness, I see way more bad ones than good ones. So one of the things I do is that I train doctors. I offer remedial ethics training for doctors undergoing disciplinary proceedings. And often it is defense organizations or their lawyers who say, look, you need to go on an ethics course, and they send them to me. And I usually tell them, look, can you send me the reflective statement as well, so we can go through it together. And I'd probably say 90% of the time, it's pretty bad. And so I want to look at what makes a bad reflective statement. One of the things, platitudes. So these are reflective statements that are full of dull, obvious comments. They tend to be very descriptive, no analysis, very little introspection. Everything is at a shallow, superficial level. The statement's also full of words like reflected, reflection, insight, as if just using those words will persuade the reader that you have in fact reflected and that you are insightful. The truth is, you're not going to trick anybody by peppering your statement with those buzzwords. It's the content that will determine whether or not you've been reflective and insightful. A great reflective statement, in my opinion, should lead the reader to think, oh, I hadn't thought of that. That person's really thought hard about this. They're the kind of aha moments that are indicative, in my view, of insight. Another common error is to have lots of hyperboles. I'm absolutely devastated by this. I'm unbelievably embarrassed. What I did was nothing short of abhorrent. If you have those in every other sentence, then their collective strength is going to be diminished. So usually you want more measured language because that has a bigger impact on the reader. And you've got to use those extremes sparingly. Then you've got lack of authenticity. The reader has to believe that you actually mean what you write. And sometimes, Sarah might agree, that is the ultimate question for the decision makers. The doctor is saying the right things, but can we actually believe them? And your personality should come across in that statement. Not long ago, I had a former client who sent me a reflective statement for the GMC. And he said, look, what do you think? I just managed to stay awake for the duration of that reading. It was very boring. It was superficial. There was no personality to it. And I told him, I think there's a lot of improvement here. And he said, yeah, interesting you say that because I used ChatGPT to write it, which explained a lot because at the moment, ChatGPT has a pretty dull, repetitive style. So I tried it myself. I went on ChatGPT and I typed in, I'm a doctor who has made a prescribing error and this has caused harm to the patient. Please write a reflective statement for me that I can submit to the General Medical Council. And it says, to the GMC, I'm writing this reflective statement to address a prescribing error that occurred under my care and supervision, resulting in harm to a patient. Okay, well, first sentence is pretty weak, in my opinion. You'd want to have something a bit more impactful to start off with. Remember, the attention level when you start a piece is at the very highest when it's the beginning. Right? So that attention level is really high. You want to take advantage of that. This is a little bit, I think, lacking in spirit. I acknowledge the gravity of the situation and take full responsibility for my actions, as well as the impact that they've had on the patient and their well-being. I deeply regret that my oversight led to harm. So a little bit careful there. You've got to be careful with that word oversight because it could be interpreted as trying to minimize the seriousness of the breach. And I'd like to express my sincere apologies to the patient and their family for their pain and distress my error has caused. As a medical professional, my foremost duty is to provide the best possible care to my patients, and I'm devastated that I fell short of meeting this obligation in this instance. So it's grammatical, but it sounds pretty formulaic. You could just change a few words and it would work just as well with pretty much any scenario. So I'd give that a 5 out of 10, which is not what you're aiming for. You're aiming for a 10 out of 10. So don't use ChatGPT yet. It's just not good enough. Or if you're going to use it as a starting point, perhaps to generate some ideas, but for heaven's sake, don't cut and paste it. So last year, I was trying to find a reflective statement that I could give doctors as an example, but I couldn't find any. So I tried to write one myself, and I published it on doctors.net.uk. And I'd like to show you parts of it, as I want to give you some concrete examples rather than just talk in an abstract way. And so this is the article, Achieving Depth in Written Reflections. And so I had to find a scenario, and I was watching an episode of This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay. Remember, it was a book, then they made it into a BBC series. And in one of the episodes, I think it's the beginning of the third episode, I think, don't quote me on it. There's the opening scene, and you've got Adam, the protagonist, the junior doctor, who's in the London Underground when a person collapses ahead of him. And there's a passerby that stops and shouts for a doctor. And Adam, who has to go, has an appointment at the theatre or something, he ignores the call and he walks past the unconscious patient lying there. But a few seconds later, he stops. He's still in the underground, and he returns to offer assistance, presumably. And as he approaches the patient, you see another figure rushing onto the scene, and standing right next to the patient. And Adam says, "Are you?" And the answer comes, "I'm a GP. I'm a GP." And Adam pauses and tells the GP, "Ah, well, I'm a dentist. I'm a trainee dentist," and briskly walks away to his theatre date. And I was thinking, okay, well, obviously very amusing. But then I thought, well, imagine if a member of the public who was present, because there was a little congregation of people by that point, discovered that Adam had in fact lied about his profession, and lodged a complaint to the GMC, who took a dim view of Adam's conduct. And Adam's lawyers or medico-legal advisors advised him to write a reflective statement ahead of a potential tribunal hearing. What would it look like? Now, at this point, some of you might be thinking, well, Daniel, the breach is so trivial that this would never happen. If you take just one thing from this evening, it should be that the GMC takes dishonesty extremely seriously, even if it occurs outside of the working environment. And you may have heard recently of that pediatric anaesthetist who used his wife's freedom pass to get to his workplace, to the hospital. I think it was at the height of the COVID pandemic. There was no one around. And he was caught at the barrier, referred to the GMC, and I think a few months ago he was suspended for 6 months. So it's not completely far-fetched, this scenario. Doctors are expected to be scrupulously honest both in and out of work. So I won't show you the whole thing. I just want to show you selected passages. This particular extract is where you demonstrate that you understand that what you did was wrong, but also why it was wrong. The why question is key. So you're demonstrating that you know that this case is all about trust, and that trust is essential in medicine, and you show why it's essential. So my lies and failure to offer help are breaches of trust, including the trust that patients and the public have in doctors acting in the best interest of patients rather than selfishly. You're effectively saying you were selfish. And the trust held by doctors that their colleagues will be honest and supportive. So you've breached the trust of patients or the public, and the public as well as your fellow doctor. If the trust of patients is eroded, they will have less faith and confidence in doctors. They may be more reluctant to visit doctors or adhere to treatment with adverse effects on their health. So you show that you know why trust is important. If the trust between colleagues is damaged, teamwork and communication will suffer, which in turn will affect patient health as well as the well-being of the clinicians caring for them. We must trust our colleagues to help and treat us with respect, which includes an expectation of truthfulness. So failure to consider other people's perspective, so self-centered. So this would be characterized by a statement which says something like this. This whole thing has been so very difficult for me. It's damaged my confidence. It's slashed my income. It's affected my career. It's soiled my reputation. It's even affected my relationship with my family. Basically, it's me, 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 me. And they don't, the GMC, the MPTS, they don't like that, understandably. You have to consider all the other people, not just you, all the other people that have been affected by your conduct or even potentially affected. Now, worse still than not thinking about others is blaming others for what happened. Make sure you don't come across as blaming somebody else. So here, this is again from the article, my actions and inactions on that day have caused or could have caused much harm, distress and inconvenience to a range of people. To the patient, whom I failed to assist, contrary to Rule 26 of the GMC about helping others both in the clinic and the community. So you show that you do know the GMC rule, but you go beyond that. You don't just quote the rule, you go beyond that. But also, my Hippocratic commitment to help the sick. To my brave GP colleague who could have used a hand in a moment of crisis, as I would have done if the roles had been reversed, and whose autonomy I violated when I lied. To the members of the public at the scene, at least one of whom was so offended by my behavior that she quite rightly complained. Remember, you don't want to be seen as blaming that person for complaining. Whose trust I breached by my conduct and my lies. To the medical profession, whose reputation, hard earned through centuries of devoted care, I have so needlessly damaged. And to my colleagues investigating this matter, whose limited time and resources I have used. I'm sorry and ashamed. So you see how you talk about, the patient, but you also talk about the GP colleague, the members of the public, the medical profession. You're thinking about others. Failure to identify concrete steps to improve matters. A good reflective statement should be a mixture of the abstract, the theoretical, the philosophical, if you like, and the practical. And if you only demonstrate one of those, then the reflection is deficient in my view. The reflecting that you do has to lead to something. It has to lead to a change. Now that can be difficult if you're engaged in an act of dishonesty. How can you show that you're honest? It's a difficult thing to show, which is why if you read the MPTS judgments, you'll read lots of sentences like dishonesty is notoriously difficult to remediate. Now, a few months ago, I developed an honesty test. I came up with 22 scenarios based on real cases. And this is an example of one. I didn't put that in the final version, but it just gives you a flavor of the scenario. And it's this, you're applying to be an assistant editor at a medical journal. The application deadline is tomorrow. The post requires candidates to be a fellow of your Royal College at the time of submitting the job application. And the online application form contains a question. Please confirm that you are a fellow of your Royal College, where you can either tick yes or no. You've applied for your fellowship and are waiting to hear the outcome of your application, which should be released next month. You're confident that you will obtain the fellowship. Which answer do you consider the best and which the worst? 1, decide not to apply for the post of assistant editor on this occasion. 2, tick yes on the application form. So this is yes to the question, please confirm that you're a fellow of your Royal College, and explain the situation if asked about it in an interview. 3, tick yes on the application form, but send an email explaining your ongoing fellowship application to the selection panel of the journal. Or 4, skip this particular question and explain the situation if asked about it in an interview. So you need to select the best one and then the worst one. And Jerard, I was wondering whether or not you can open up the chat. So what would be really useful, and don't be influenced by others, and this is just for my own interest, just put in the chat, if you can use it, which you consider to be the best answer and which you consider the worst. Just put 2 numbers. The first one should be best answer, the second one should be the worst answer. This is all anonymous. You're not going to be referred to the GMC. Can I do that, Jerard?
I have opened the chat is open to people. So if people look on the
We won't keep this. This is purely for my own interest. Let me see what happens.
I'm not seeing any responses coming through.
Don't be shy. Don't be shy. I don't think we can tell who's giving the answers.
You can't tell. Daniel, I think we may have to move on. I'm not sure that's going to work on the chat function. I apologize.
Oh, you don't think? Let's see. We'll just make it up. 6 and 8 doesn't even exist. Oh, okay. I understand. All right. Okay. So, well, at least we tried. Let me go back. Okay. So, option 1. So you all know what you've chosen. Option 1, decide not to apply for the post of assistant editor on this occasion. Well, that is the best option because it's the only totally honest course of action in this case, right? The post requires candidates to be a fellow of the Royal College at the time of submitting the job application. You're not, and so 1 is the most honest answer here. 2, tick yes on the application form and explain the situation if asked about it in an interview. That's the worst answer. That's just an outright lie. 3, tick yes on the application form and send an email. Well, it's less than fully honest because you have ticked yes in answer to that question when the answer actually is no. So that's less than fully honest. And option 4 is not fully honest either because you're evading a direct question and you'll only reveal the truth if asked about it in an interview. So 1 is the best and 2 is the worst. You'll know whether you got that right or not. Anyway, I've done 22 of those, and then I give it to the client. They answer it, and then they have a score out of 44. And I think I asked 6 professors of medical ethics who are also doctors to answer the questions, and then what they answered was the correct answer. All right, so let's move on. So, okay, explain the corrective actions taken and the low likelihood of repeating errors. So remember, this is what you've actually done. This is from the article and Adam Kay's case. To deepen my understanding of these ethical standards and medical professionalism, I've attended courses on medical ethics. I've undergone stress management classes to help me deal with my anxiety and modified my lifestyle to reduce the stress and fatigue that contributed to my poor conduct. To increase my clinical confidence, I have completed courses on advanced life support and advanced pediatric life support, and I intend to renew these skills regularly. As I'm relatively young, I may in the future encounter another emergency situation in the community. If I do, I will offer help promptly. If another clinician is on the scene, I will introduce myself accurately and offer assistance. Armed with the lessons learned from this incident and the above courses, I feel ready to tackle any crisis with courage and dignity. Now, incidentally, when you attend a course, like here he refers to attending a course on medical ethics, at some point, either in this reflective statement or in a separate reflective statement, you should explain why that course was useful. Right? It's not enough for you just to attend a course and assume that's going to tick that box. There are many comments in tribunal determinations where the tribunal says, oh, Dr. X attended that course. It seems that it made no difference whatsoever, right? So you want to attend the course and then, in a paragraph or 2 or more if you want, explain what benefit you derived from it, what you learned on the course, what insights you gleaned from it. Too long. I think Jerard talked about this. You don't want the rambling stream of consciousness statement with lots of repetition, lots of irrelevant material, because all that superfluous material dilutes the strength of the good stuff that may be hidden in there. And
I think, Daniel, sorry to interrupt it, Sarah, I think it is about the quality, isn't it, rather than the quantity. So how you can show the learning and that the learning is embedded and so on. I think that's really important. It's not about reams and reams. Yeah.
Absolutely. There isn't, it'd be a mistake to think, look, I've written 25 pages. It must be good. Because actually there might just be two pages of good stuff in there, and it's all lost amongst the rambling that goes on. I mean, I do find many of these statements have a lot of repetition. As a barrister, I remember being told you just say it once, but say it well. So yes, it is a persuasive document, as Jerard said, because, well, especially if you're writing it, for disciplinary situation, because you're trying to persuade the reader that you have truly thought deeply about this issue, that you have derived lessons from it, and that you will implement those lessons if you encounter a similar situation again. And once you realize that it's a persuasive document, then you'll realize, well, actually, there can't be any typos in it. There can't be any grammatical errors in it, because that would annoy the reader. And also it would suggest that I haven't spent very long on the document. So you need to make sure that you thoroughly proofread the document and that it reads well. And one way to make that easier, to make it easier to read, is to follow a clear structure with headings, if you like. And there's no single structure that needs to be followed, but there needs to be some logic to the structure that you use. insight. So insight is important because if you have it, you're unlikely to repeat the same mistake. And if you read the judgments of the MPTS, there seems to be a sort of scale of insight with no insight at all on one end of the scale. And then you've got, in between kind of limited insight, incomplete insight, developing insight, and then finally you have full insight. And that's what you're aiming for. You're aiming for the bullseye, the full insight, because all the other ones, even developing insight is usually followed by but. The doctor's getting there, but isn't quite there. There needs to be more work.
On that point, Daniel, I've had a doctor sent back more than once and not been allowed to go back to work because the doctor had not managed to develop adequate insight at the impact of the allegation and failing.
Yeah, that's helpful. So Hardy Cross Dillard, who was a well-known lawyer and judge, wrote in this little-known essay, "Insight is the revelation resulting usually from prolonged effort and intermittent brooding, by which unfamiliar phenomena are suddenly grasped, or familiar phenomena are suddenly seen in a fresh light." And for wisdom, he said, the capacity to reach beyond the limits of the rational faculties. It is a product of a reflective mind playing upon experience. There's another good article from David and Elson. David is a doctor, Elson is a solicitor, on lack of insight. And in this article, they wrote, when the fitness to practice of a doctor is under consideration, the term insight encompasses the willingness and ability to 1, recognize and accept that what one has done is wrong, 2, explore and understand why the adverse behavior occurred, and 3, comprehend the reasons why one needs to avoid repeating errors and identify steps that need to be taken to rectify the behaviors. I think that's a helpful checklist of considerations, and you're less likely to miss something important if you follow that checklist. Now, if you can apply all that we discussed this evening and produce a strong reflection, then as Jerard said, it can make all the difference. And here's an extract from a very recent MPTS case involving one of my clients. I'm very proud of it. And it says here that the tribunal was of the view that this insight could not have been developed by producing reflections simply as a formality. And it considered that Dr. F had demonstrated in those detailed reflections a highly developed, personalized insight into the specific circumstances and context of his misconduct. So he didn't use ChatGPT. He spent a long time on this, coming up with multiple revisions over a period of time. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that his impressive reflection resulted in a much more lenient sanction than he otherwise would have received. So I want to finish with another quote by the French poet Paul Valéry, who said, "A poem is never finished, only abandoned." And the same is true, in my view, of a reflective statement. You could always make it better. So don't write it all in one sitting and send it off. Remember what Dillard said about insight usually arising from prolonged effort. Sleep on it, look at it again with fresh eyes multiple times, show it to other people, think of ways to make it better. In other words, give it the attention it deserves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really good, Daniel. Thank you so much. Sarah, I could see there were some questions coming in there. Have you managed to pull anything out that we can look at? In the time that you're muted at the moment, Sarah, I think.
Apologies. I think the first question might be quite an interesting one for Daniel, given the David and Elson slide that he put up. Somebody's asked the question, how can you demonstrate insight if you don't agree with the premise of the allegation?
Yeah, that old chestnut. And I think the GMC does comment on that, don't they, in one of their documents, saying, well, you can still demonstrate that you appreciate the gravity of the situation, that you appreciate the seriousness of what is being alleged. So you might factually dispute a particular aspect of it, but you still demonstrate understanding of the situation and of the situation. If it were proved, if it were the case, then you understand exactly, why this is such a serious matter.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to add to that?
I was desperately racking my mind for a case that I've had where that has been the situation. I haven't had any, and I would be caveating it the way that Daniel has talked about. Sarah, have you had any where the doctor didn't accept it at all?
I think sometimes what I would say is that there's a sort of an MPTS hearing is often many years in the making. So sometimes things that at the beginning of the hearing, at the beginning of the process, might appear to be extremely important, actually by the time of any hearing have fallen away, and vice versa, that things at the beginning perhaps didn't attract that much attention or warrant a huge amount of reflection may start to show a greater importance in terms of the doctor. So I think this long process that Daniel's referred to of going back and looking at things and trying to have a fresh pair of eyes, I think that's quite important. And of course, we haven't really touched on GMC processes, but there are separate stages where facts are decided, and then impairment, and then if there's impairment, where there's a sanction. And so sometimes the context of the facts can be quite important. And that's what sort of the lawyers will do, is that sometimes providing a context whilst not seeking necessarily to deny that something has happened, that can be quite important as well. The next question I had, Jerard, was from a GP who was asking about how you might decide the threshold for referring a colleague to the GMC, and where somebody might be able to get advice regarding.
Well, the GMC have published their own guidance on when fitness to practice is impaired. There's a legal definition of when fitness to practice might be impaired, and I think that in the context of a situation where you feel that that is a risk, then you could sort of thing that you could discuss with your defence organisation. You could set out the situation. You could discuss it with an uninvolved senior colleague and get their view on it. You could look at the GMC guidance I've referred to, or the GMC definitions I've referred to specifically. But I think the overarching thing is that if you really believe that that is the case, that a doctor's fitness to practice may be impaired, then you've got to take that step back and not just think purely about the relationship that you may or may not have with that doctor. You've got to think about the impact that that doctor's practice may be having on patients, maybe many patients, maybe hundreds of patients. So I think that you seek advice, you speak to your defence organisation, you review the guidance, and you act to protect patients. And even if you're wrong, even if ultimately nothing comes from it, if you feel that's the right thing to do and you can justify it to yourself, then that seems reasonable.
Thank you. We've had another question, which I will start with, and that's the health of doctors who are undergoing these investigations, and how the GMC or MPTS might look at a doctor who has needed support, or perhaps needed to drop their working hours and so on, how that is regarded. And I'm very grateful that that question has been asked, because I think one of the points that we would want to stress here is that luckily GMC referrals rarely lead to MPTS hearings, but that certainly at the MDU we recognise the stress that this can cause for members. I would like to give a shout out for Practitioner Health, who do incredible work for doctors who are dealing with stress and anxiety. And also on the MDU website, we do have a whole section marked on wellbeing and so on. I think reverting to the question then, in terms of how the GMC and MPTS may regard a doctor who has health issues, I think it's important to stress that the GMC guidance is that doctors should take independent advice on their own fitness to practice. That if you're worried that you're becoming unwell and that work is unmanageable, as a doctor, you should be seeking advice from somebody independent to give advice. and to do that. And I think it would be very difficult to criticise a doctor who has sought appropriate advice to keep themselves safe and so on.
The general thing, though, Sarah, I think I hope you'll agree with me, is that the GMC are generally pretty supportive of ill doctors and getting ill doctors back into the workplace. Sometimes, that can take a long time, but they are generally, in my experience, pretty supportive of that, often over many years.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely important to state that. And as I say, the other thing we should mention is that we have a peer support program here at the MDU. So doctors who are going through a difficult process can speak to somebody who has been through that process and has come out the other side for that personal insight and so on.
Yeah, I mean, we've been feeding back to the GMC for a long time, over the last 10 years, certainly a lot about the impacts of these investigations on doctors, and their processes have changed over that time in a way to try and reduce the stress, if that's at all possible. There are a number of resources available to help doctors, and as Sarah said, we do have our own peer support.
And Daniel, we've had a few questions about how people can reflect well, and I believe that you did a podcast for the MDU a little while ago. I wonder if you might want just to tell us a little bit about that, so that our attendees tonight can find that and learn.
Oh, well, I wish I had the link, but I think I did it. I think it was last year, and I covered some of the things that I covered this evening as well. But I think there's some degree of overlap, but there may be some new things as well in the podcast. And I think I also there was a GP as well who was there, who talked about the sorts of reflections that she had to do. And she said she had to do 2 a week, which is quite demanding. But it is right that there is some variation in how you would write a reflection depending on the context. And if you had to do 2 reflections a week on something, you wouldn't expect it to be the same as the reflection you're doing for the GMC to try to save your skin. It would be different. But yeah, I mean, have a listen to that MDU podcast, and it may be, hopefully most of the people listening to this are not having to do a GMC reflection. They may be, it may be more pertinent for them to listen to that podcast, which deals as well with the more mundane, if you like, reflections.
I'm sure we can send that link out. We'll find it, Daniel. I know it. I've heard it myself, so we'll find it.
Thank you. And I think the other question that I wanted to ask of Jerard is whether you found that there's any change in perhaps the younger doctors coming through and older doctors in terms of reflection, because I guess that for some of us who may be older than the audience, reflection is perhaps less familiar than those who are going through the current medical school training, where reflection and so on is embedded from a very early stage. Is that something that you noted?
Well, all I can do is agree with that. I find that the younger doctors in general tend to be more attuned to the idea of doing it, of doing that reflective practice. There obviously is great variability across all age groups. It's not just younger doctors are better at it. I'm not saying that, but in general, they often tend to engage with it more easily than the older doctors. I have to say I've got plenty of examples of doctors senior to me who around longer than I have, who really engage with it really well and take it very well. So I don't want to denigrate anybody, but I think in general the way that medical schools are teaching people these days is helping people engage with that reflective process. It's a big thing through the foundation program and through medical school itself. So I'm hopeful that will continue to allow doctors to improve generally.
Thank you. And I suppose that I was going to say to Daniel, are there 3 top tips that you're able to give, your top 3 tips for writing a good reflection that you might be able to share with us as the sort of take-home message?
Gosh, I've given away all my tips, I think, in this talk, but one of them is take your time, don't rush it. That's top tip. Second, show it to people. Jerard mentioned it. Show it to people. Get feedback. And and use use the MDU, use your lawyers. Don't be, I hope I don't get in trouble for this. A lot of the time people come and see me and they say, look, they don't seem to have much guidance. They don't feel that they've got lots of people helping them. And I said, look, you need people to guide you through this. Don't try to do it on your own. You contact your defense organizations. Don't hesitate to send them an email saying, look, I'm not sure about this. Can what's your view on this? And I'm sure the MDU are more than happy to assist those people, because as we've all said, it's an extremely stressful time, and you don't want them navigating this on their own. It's just not good for their case, and it's not good for their mental health as well. So that's my second tip, is make sure you use as many people as possible to help you. And then the third one, maybe read other MPTS determinations relating to your case. So if you've had sex with your patient, there are lots of MPT cases about doctors who've had sex with their patients, and you'll be able to read what is it. Well, you'll be able to learn from the mistakes of the doctors, and you'll be able to learn from the good practices of these doctors, because the MPTS, as you know, Sarah, says we really like this. We were unimpressed with this, and so you can learn in that way as well. So go to the MPTS website. The determinations or the judgments are all there for you to read, and often you can pick up some really interesting tips from that as well. So those probably are my three.
If I can just expand on that, I know we're getting close time to what's better, we're slightly over time, but I just want to say one thing. One of the reasons that I like to make sure that people have spoken about it is it's easy to become focused on what has happened and your approach to what has happened. So this isn't just on the reflection, this is your approach to the whole case. And sometimes going to somebody else who you value, whose opinions you value in a clinical setting, and saying, look, this is what happened. I think I did that right, or I think that was the right approach, wasn't it? And actually having them then say, well, let's just go through all of this gradually, and to have somebody else's viewpoint brought to bear on your situation, particularly somebody whose opinion you value, is really useful to start you on that reflective process, because it makes you, gets you out of the single track, which is, I think I was okay, or it wasn't that bad, or it allows you to take on other people's views. So that's one of the reasons I like to make sure that people have talked about it. And that senior trusted colleague, we've all got one that we would go to and say, what do you think? It's, I think, a really helpful way to start it. And then that gets you then into a position where you can reflect effectively, as Daniel's given us some advice on doing. I think we're going to have to call it there, Sarah. We're after 8 o'clock. Now, can I thank you everybody again for turning up to hear us talk. And Daniel, thank you so much for coming along and giving us of your expertise to the MDU members. And Sarah, thank you very much for dealing with all those questions. I'm really sorry that we can never answer all the questions we get. There's many hundreds of people in the webinar, and lots of questions come in. They sort of fly through in the last few minutes of the webinar, which makes it quite difficult. So thank you again for all your questions. I hope your night was okay, and I wish you all the well for the rest of the week. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.